London, 1944. A strange buzzing fills the sky, then silence, and a moment later, an explosion tears through the city. These were Hitler's weapons of vengeance, the V-1 and V-2. Rockets so advanced, they were decades ahead of their time. They could reach the edge of space and return faster than sound. But behind these weapons lay something even more sinister. Secret projects that promised to change the course of history or destroy it entirely. Why did they fail? And how close did Nazi Germany come to turning science into total annihilation? Now, let's uncover the terrifying truth behind Hitler's dream of revenge. Before we dive in, like this video and drop any comment below. It really helps more people find our documentaries. Thank you. In the dimly lit corridors of power in Nazi Germany, long before the first V-1 lifted from its launch ramp, or the V-2 roared toward the heavens, a strange idea took root. An idea born not of strategy or science, but of belief. Adolf Hitler, the man who sought to reshape the world through war, was not content with conventional weapons. He saw himself as a man of destiny, chosen to bend history through will alone. To him, the war was not merely a contest of armies and factories. It was a spiritual struggle, a battle of faith and imagination. And when the tide of war began to turn, when reason whispered that victory was slipping away, Hitler turned to mysticism and miracle. He dreamed of Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons. Weapons that would shatter the morale of his enemies and rekindle the fading faith of his people.
When you look at Hitler's relationship with science, you begin to realize that it wasn't really about logic or evidence, it was about belief. He was utterly convinced that the universe itself could be bent by sheer willpower. To him, technology wasn't just machinery, it was destiny made visible. Hitler surrounded himself with people who shared his fascination for the occult. The Thule Society, Heinrich Himmler's SS scholars, men who genuinely believed they were reviving the ancient powers of the Aryan race. There were expeditions to Tibet searching for lost civilizations, studies of runes and ancient symbols, even attempts to trace mystical energy lines across Europe. This was not pseudoscience on the margins, it was ideology turned into ritual. He saw the Wunderwaffe as part of this same mythic struggle. The V-weapons were not merely tools of war, they were meant to be proof that Germany was chosen, that its destiny could not be denied. And in that belief, you can see the tragedy, because when faith becomes stronger than reason, the line between genius and delusion disappears.
By 1943, the once invincible Wehrmacht was in retreat on every front. The Red Army had broken the myth of German invincibility at Stalingrad, and the Western Allies were reclaiming the skies over Europe. For the first time, the Reich was on the defensive. Yet within Hitler's circle, defeat was unthinkable. The Führer demanded a miracle, and the scientists of Germany, engineers, physicists, visionaries, were expected to deliver it. The concept of the Wunderwaffe was more than technological ambition. It was psychological warfare, conceived to restore a crumbling image of invincibility. Hitler believed that one breathtaking technological leap could reverse the course of the war, not through numbers or logistics, but through shock and awe. The Reich's propaganda machine echoed this faith. Newspapers whispered of revolutionary weapons in development. The people were told that soon the Führer would unveil instruments of such power that the Allies would beg for peace. It was not just science, it was mythology wrapped in steel. Deep in underground complexes, laboratories, and hidden facilities, a new breed of German scientists worked in secrecy. They were men like Wernher von Braun, the young, brilliant engineer who dreamed not of war, but of space travel. Yet his vision was co-opted by a regime that saw rockets not as vehicles of exploration, but as tools of vengeance. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket were the first fruits of this dark alliance between science and ideology. But before they existed, the seeds had been sown years earlier, in Hitler's obsession with destiny. The Führer often spoke of history as a matter of will, of bending the impossible to one's purpose through sheer belief. His fascination with ancient symbols, astrology, and occultism was no secret. He saw himself as a man who could command reality to obey him. In his mind, if the German people's faith was strong enough, the universe itself would deliver victory. When tanks and rifles failed, that faith turned to technology as religion. The Reich's leaders began to treat scientists like high priests of a new order. The laboratories became temples of hope, where the impossible might yet be forged. Projects that once seemed fantastical, supersonic aircraft, long-range missiles, even energy weapons, suddenly became matters of state urgency. But this feverish pursuit had less to do with practicality than psychological necessity. The Nazi leadership understood that morale was collapsing. Entire cities were being erased from maps by Allied bombers. Civilians hid in ruins. Factories were crippled. The promise of a Wunderwaffe was a promise of salvation, a story to believe in when there was nothing left to believe. It was a political miracle disguised as a technological one. Even within the upper echelons of command, few truly believed that such weapons could win the war. But they might, they thought, delay the inevitable, buying time, dividing the Allies, or perhaps forcing Britain or America into negotiations. The Wunderwaffe became the embodiment of denial, an illusion of power in an age of desperation. In the propaganda films of the late war, the tone had changed. Gone were the triumphant parades and the confident speeches of conquest. In their place came images of secret laboratories, of white-coated engineers, and colossal machines emerging from the shadows. These were not simply updates from the front. They were sermons of hope to a nation drowning in defeat. Each mention of a new weapon was a spark in the darkness. It gave people something to cling to, even as Allied bombs fell around them. And Hitler fed that hope relentlessly. He believed that technology could be destiny, that the miracle weapon would appear at the final hour, like a sword from legend, and strike down Germany's enemies. But this faith blinded him to reality. The Wunderwaffe were miracles only on paper, concepts too advanced for their time, born in a collapsing economy and fueled by slave labor. The Reich lacked the materials, the fuel, and the time. The scientists who could have led Germany into a new technological era were instead bound to the will of a man who demanded results faster than nature allowed. The story of the Wunderwaffe begins then, not with the first rocket launch, but with an idea, the belief that technology could substitute for strategy, that machines could compensate for defeat, that faith could bend physics to ideology. Hitler's obsession transformed scientific innovation into an act of desperation. The laboratories of Peenemünde and Mittelwerk became the stage for both genius and horror, where the boundaries of possibility were pushed at the cost of thousands of human lives. It is here that the paradox of the Wunderwaffe was born. They were both the pinnacle of human innovation and the symbol of human delusion. Each project was a reflection of the regime itself, grandiose, visionary, and utterly detached from reality. As the Allies closed in, the promises grew wilder. There were rumors of death rays, anti-gravity craft, even atomic weapons. In truth, the Reich was collapsing from within, but the myth endured because it had to. The Wunderwaffe was not about victory. It was about belief. For Hitler, these weapons represented more than military tools. They were extensions of his will, proof that destiny still favored him, He once told his generals that the world would soon witness the greatest surprise in military history. That surprise would come in the form of the V-weapons, the first of their kind, terrifying in concept, spectacular in design. But they would also reveal the fatal flaw of the regime that created them, the belief that technology could replace reason, and faith could replace truth. The origins of the Wunderwaffe, then, are not found in blueprints or equations. They are found in the psychology of defeat, in the desperation of a nation that turned to myth when reality became unbearable. It was not the scientists who first imagined them, but the dictator who demanded them, a man who mistook imagination for power and turned his country into a laboratory for madness. And so began one of the strangest chapters in the history of war. A race not to conquer the world, but to believe it could still be conquered, even as it slipped away. The story of Hitler's weapons of vengeance begins not in victory, but in faith, fear, and fantasy, the cradle of the Wunderwaffe. In the final years of the Second World War, the war that Germany itself had unleashed began to turn back upon its creator. The great cities of the Reich lay shattered beneath the weight of Allied bombers. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, all had felt the full fury of retribution from the skies. And yet, even as defeat loomed within the hidden laboratories of Nazi Germany, a new weapon was being prepared. A weapon that would not win the war, but would make the world tremble. They called it the V-1, Vergeltungswaffe 1, the weapon of vengeance 1. To the Allies, it would become known by another name, the buzz bomb.
When we talk about the V-1, we're really talking about one of the first true cruise missiles in history, but also one of the crudest. It was terrifying not because of its precision or sophistication, but because of its simplicity. A pulse jet engine, a few gyroscopes, and a warhead. That was it. It was cheap, mass-producible, and utterly indiscriminate. To the people of London, the V-1 wasn't a military weapon. It was a psychological one. You'd hear that mechanical buzzing in the sky, growing louder and louder, and when the sound stopped, that was the moment of absolute terror. Everyone knew what came next. It wasn't about destroying factories or airfields, it was about breaking morale. But ironically, it had the opposite effect. The British didn't collapse. They adapted. They learned. And in that resilience, you can see the limits of the so-called weapons of vengeance. Technology can terrify, but it cannot conquer the human spirit.
The story of the V-1 begins not with triumph, but with desperation. By 1943, Germany's cities were in ruins, its air force weakened, and its industry stretched to the limit. Hitler demanded a weapon that could strike back at the heart of Britain, without risking pilots or aircraft. The Luftwaffe could no longer bomb London with impunity, but perhaps machines could do what men no longer could. The idea was simple, almost brutally so. Create a flying bomb, a pilotless aircraft that could carry a ton of explosives across the English Channel, guided not by human hands, but by gyroscopes and crude autopilot. It needed to be cheap, easy to produce, and terrifying to its victims. And so, engineers at the Fieseler Company, under the direction of Robert Lusser and Fritz Goslau, began developing what was essentially a small airplane with a bomb for a body and a pulse jet engine strapped to its back. It was ugly, unstable, and loud, but it worked. The heart of the V-1 was its pulse jet, a simple yet ingenious device. Instead of the complex, expensive turbines used in aircraft, the pulse jet operated by rapidly opening and closing valves, igniting fuel in violent bursts that created a rhythmic buzzing roar. That sound, mechanical, uneven, almost alive, became the weapon's signature. People in London would later describe it with dread. a low, distant growl rising over the horizon, growing louder, louder, until suddenly it stopped. And then, silence. A few seconds later came the explosion. The V-1 was, in every sense, a weapon of psychological terror. In June 1944, just days after the Allied landings in Normandy, the first V-1s were launched against London from hidden sites in northern France. The timing was deliberate. Hitler's revenge for D-Day. At first, the results were horrifying. Hundreds of these crude flying bombs crossed the Channel each day. Their range was about 250 kilometers, just enough to reach London from the French coast. They flew at speeds of over 600 kilometers per hour, too fast for most anti-aircraft guns to track effectively, and too low for radar to easily detect. On June 13th, the first V-1 hit London, killing 6 people. Within a week, dozens more followed. By the end of the first month, thousands of Londoners were dead or injured. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. To the people on the ground, there was no pattern, no warning. The bombs came at random, day and night. Each time the engines cut out, every ear froze, waiting for the inevitable. For the Nazi regime, the propaganda value was immense. The headlines in Germany proclaimed that London was being obliterated, that the miracle weapons were turning the tide of war. Hitler himself saw the V-1 as proof that destiny still favored him. But the reality was far different. The V-1 was cheap, yes, but also crude. Only about a quarter of the bombs launched ever reached their intended target. Many crashed into the Channel or fell short due to fuel or guidance failures. The launch sites themselves, concrete ramps hidden among forests and fields, were soon discovered by Allied reconnaissance. Britain responded with characteristic speed and ingenuity. New anti-aircraft defenses were deployed along the southern coast, radar systems recalibrated, and squadrons of fast interceptors were stationed to hunt the incoming missiles. The most famous defenders were the pilots of the Royal Air Force, flying the latest versions of the Spitfire and the Tempest. They developed a dangerous but effective tactic, approaching the V-1 from behind and using the airflow from their wings to tip the bomb's wing, sending it tumbling off course without firing a shot. Shooting it directly risked detonating the warhead in mid-air, often at lethal proximity. In just a few weeks, British defenses became devastatingly effective. The success rate of V-1 attacks plummeted. Anti-aircraft fire grew more accurate. Radar-guided guns filled the skies with a curtain of shells, and the RAF destroyed hundreds in mid-air. Soon, Allied ground forces overran the launch sites in northern France, forcing the Germans to move operations to the Low Countries. But with each move, their range to London decreased, and the effectiveness of the weapon fell further still. The V-1 was never a strategic weapon in the true sense. It could not win battles or destroy military infrastructure. It could only terrorize. Its impact was emotional, not tactical. A strike against the morale of the British people. And in that, too, it failed. Rather than breaking the will of London, the buzz bombs only hardened it. People adapted. Warning sirens were established. Shelters were reinforced. The British learned to listen, to judge by sound alone whether the next bomb would fall near or pass overhead. When the droning engine stopped, they had mere seconds to act. And yet, they did. Every day, life continued. Churchill himself described the campaign as a battle of nerves. It was one that Britain ultimately won. By the end of 1944, more than 22,000 V-1s had been launched. Around a quarter reached England. Nearly 6,000 people were killed, and tens of thousands were injured. Terrible numbers, but nowhere near what Germany had hoped. The Allies, meanwhile, had learned from the experience. The V-1 spurred advances in radar, air defense, and jet propulsion. technologies that would define the next generation of warfare. When the last launch site was captured in March 1945, the era of the buzz bomb came to an end. But its legacy, as the world's first true cruise missile, had already begun. The V-1 was, in essence, a paradox, a weapon both brilliant in simplicity and barbaric in purpose. It embodied the Nazi approach to technology at the end of the war, a mixture of desperation, genius, and cruelty. Each bomb cost only a fraction of a modern fighter plane, and yet it consumed enormous human effort. Thousands of forced laborers worked and died in underground factories to produce them. Every V-1 that fell on London carried with it not only a warhead of explosives, but the suffering of those who had built it in darkness. It was not a weapon of victory, but of vengeance. In the grand scope of history, the V-1 achieved little militarily. It could not turn back the tide of Allied advance, nor restore Germany's fading might. But it left behind a haunting image of technology used not to build, but to terrorize, of human ingenuity serving human despair. When its engine buzzed overhead, it spoke not of power, but of fear. The fear of a regime that had run out of time and turned to machines to strike where men could no longer fight. The V-1 was the first of Hitler's weapons of vengeance. And though it was meant to punish Britain, it ultimately revealed something far greater, that even in the face of relentless terror, the human spirit cannot be bombed into submission. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen, a weapon that defied the boundaries of Earth itself. When the first V-2 rocket roared to life over the testing fields of Peenemünde, the sky itself seemed to tremble. This was not merely an evolution of warfare. It was a revolution. For the first time in history, humanity had built a machine that could cross the edge of space before returning to strike its target. It was a leap into the unknown, born not from the pursuit of discovery, but from the desperate logic of total war. Behind this technological marvel stood a young and brilliant engineer, Wernher von Braun, a man whose dreams were as boundless as the heavens. To von Braun and his team, the V-2 was not just a weapon. It was the first step toward the stars. But in Hitler's Germany, science served the Reich. Peenemünde became both a laboratory and a factory of nightmares, where engineers chased the perfection of flight, while prisoners labored and died to make their dreams real.
When we talk about the V-2, we're talking about the moment humanity left the Earth, not for exploration, but for annihilation. It was the first object ever built by human hands to cross the edge of space. Imagine that. A weapon designed to destroy cities also became the first spacecraft in history. That duality, genius and horror intertwined, defines the V-2's legacy. What's even more striking is how the men behind it saw themselves. Wernher von Braun once said he cared more about reaching the moon than about where his rockets landed on Earth. To him, the V-2 was a stepping stone to the stars, but for those living in London or Antwerp, it was nothing but terror from the heavens. In a way, the V-2 embodies the moral paradox of modern science, the idea that our greatest leaps forward often begin in the darkest chapters of our past.
The V-2, or Vergeltungswaffe 2, the weapon of vengeance 2, was the first true ballistic missile. Its engine burned a volatile mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen, propelling it faster than the speed of sound. It rose beyond the clouds, higher than any aircraft could follow, into the thin reaches of the stratosphere. For a brief moment, it touched the threshold of space, before plunging down toward Earth at nearly 3,500 kilometers per hour. There was no warning, no defense, no counterattack. The V-2 struck without mercy or sound. The explosion was the first sign that it had arrived. To the citizens of London, Antwerp, and Liège, the V-2 was the embodiment of a new kind of terror. Unlike the V-1, whose droning engine announced its approach, the V-2 offered no chance to hide. One moment you were alive. The next, an entire block had vanished. More than 1,000 of these missiles rained down during the final years of the war. Yet, despite their fearsome power, they changed little on the battlefield. Each rocket was an engineering masterpiece, but a strategic failure. The British, though helpless to intercept the missiles, fought back through intelligence and sabotage. Allied bombers struck Peenemünde in 1943, scattering von Braun's team and forcing the relocation of production to underground tunnels in Nordhausen. There, under the mountains of Mittelwerk, thousands of forced laborers toiled in unimaginable conditions. The cost of every rocket was measured not only in marks and steel, but in human lives. And yet, amidst the horror, there was also brilliance. The V-2 program represented the birth of modern rocketry. Every stage of its design, the gyroscopic guidance systems, the turbopumps, the combustion chambers, laid the groundwork for what would come after the war. When the Reich collapsed, von Braun and many of his engineers surrendered to the Americans, carrying with them their blueprints, prototypes, and knowledge. Within a decade, that same expertise would send American rockets into orbit, and 2 decades later, to the moon. It's a bitter irony of history. The same technology that brought destruction to London became the foundation for humanity's greatest scientific triumphs. As one historian later put it, they aimed for London, but hit the stars. In purely military terms, the V-2 was an extravagant failure. Each missile cost more than an Allied bomber and could carry only a single ton of explosives. Its accuracy was poor, its logistical footprint massive, and its impact negligible on the course of the war. But, in symbolic terms, it was staggering. The V-2 showed the world that the sky was no longer the limit. It was the dawn of the missile age, and the beginning of the modern world's uneasy marriage between science and destruction. As the war drew to a close, the echoes of the V-2's launch reverberated far beyond the ruins of Germany. The Soviet Union recovered its own share of rockets and engineers, sparking a technological arms race that would define the Cold War. From the ashes of Hitler's dream of vengeance rose 2 competing empires of science, each racing to master the heavens, each haunted by the weapon that had started it all. The V-2 was a paradox, a masterpiece of engineering built for the ugliest of purposes. It did not win the war for Germany, but it changed the world forever. It proved that mankind's reach could extend beyond the atmosphere, and that even in the darkest moments of history, the drive to innovate, to explore, to push beyond the impossible, remains an unstoppable force. The age of rockets began not in peace, but in vengeance. And from that vengeance was born the path to the stars. By 1944, the weapons of vengeance had become a familiar threat to Europe. From the forests and hidden ramps of northern France and the Low Countries, waves of V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets rained down on London, Antwerp, and Liège. For the civilians caught in their path, the terror was immediate, visceral, and inescapable. Every day, the skies seemed to hum with the threat of destruction, and yet the reality behind the numbers tells a more complex story. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the Germans launched approximately 22,000 V-1s against the United Kingdom. Of these, roughly 6,000 actually reached their targets, leaving a trail of destruction and death. The buzz bomb became infamous not only for its crude design and droning engine, but for its psychological impact. The randomness of its strikes created a sense of perpetual vulnerability. Neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, families were torn apart, and the sound of the pulse jet, became a daily reminder of the war's reach into civilian life.
What's often misunderstood about Hitler's so-called Wunderwaffe is that they were never capable of turning the tide of the war. The V-1s, the V-2s, even the secret projects and experimental aircraft, all of them were impressive on paper, terrifying in execution, but strategically almost meaningless. By the time they were deployed, the Allies had already established overwhelming superiority in men, material, and logistics. This was a war of attrition, a battle of numbers, production, and supply chains, not a war of miracles. The reality is stark. No weapon, however advanced or frightening, could compensate for the imbalance in resources. The Allies rebuilt bombed cities, replaced lost aircraft, and reinforced morale far faster than the Reich could destroy them. Mathematics, engineering, and industrial capacity won the day, not fantastical miracle weapons. The Wunderwaffe may have inspired terror, but it could not override the fundamental arithmetic of war.
At the same time, the V-2 rocket was unleashed. It was a far deadlier instrument, the first ballistic missile in history, capable of supersonic speed and invulnerable to interception. Over 3,000 V-2s were launched in the final months of the war, each one a 1-ton warhead of devastation. The rockets flew higher than any aircraft could reach, and by the time they fell back to Earth, they struck with catastrophic force and near-perfect surprise. For the people on the ground, there was no warning, no siren, no moment to hide. Only the sudden flash and the roar of destruction. The human cost of these weapons was immense. The V-1 attacks killed around 6,000 people, while injuries numbered in the tens of thousands. The V-2 rockets claimed nearly 3,000 lives, leaving another 7,000 or more injured. London bore the brunt of the assaults, but Antwerp, in Belgium, suffered under the V-2 bombardment during the final months of 1944 and early 1945, with entire port facilities damaged and tens of thousands forced to flee their homes. Across Europe, the psychological toll was heavy, as people were confronted by a weapon that could strike without warning, at any hour of the day or night. Yet, for all the terror they inflicted, the strategic effect of the V-weapons was minimal. They were expensive and resource-intensive to produce, and their accuracy was limited. The V-1, while numerous, was slow and easy for aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses to intercept. The British countermeasures, anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and fighter patrols, reduced the effectiveness of the bombardment significantly, shooting down hundreds of the flying bombs before they reached their targets. The V-2 was unstoppable in flight, but its production was complex and costly, and many rockets fell short due to guidance or mechanical failures. From a military perspective, neither weapon could halt the advance of Allied forces, nor could it break the industrial or logistical momentum of Britain or the Western Allies. Factories continued to operate, transport networks remained functional, and the daily rhythm of war persisted, despite the explosions in the sky. The Allies' ability to repair, rebuild, and maintain morale proved far more resilient than Hitler had anticipated. The V-weapons were conceived as instruments of shock and awe, designed to terrorize and demoralize, and in that respect, they partially succeeded. Londoners hid in underground shelters, air raid sirens became part of daily life, and the uncertainty of when the next missile would strike created a climate of constant fear. But fear alone could not stop armies advancing across Europe, nor could it undo the strategic alliances that had been forged over years of diplomacy and war. Even Hitler came to recognize their limitations. By late 1944, with the Allied armies closing in from both east and west, the V-1 and V-2 were no longer tools of revenge. They were desperate gestures, attempts to project power in the face of inevitable defeat. They demanded vast human and material resources. Thousands of laborers, engineers and technicians, many of them enslaved, toiling in underground factories under horrific conditions. Each missile was a testament to the human cost of technological obsession, and to the tragic irony that the same brilliance which made them possible also made them futile. In the end, the weapons of vengeance exacted a high price in human lives and left scars on the cities they struck. Yet strategically, they failed to achieve their ultimate goal. They could not stop the Allies' war machine, and they could not shatter the resolve of a population determined to survive. Britain remained unbroken. Antwerp recovered and supplied the advancing armies. The Allies continued their march toward Berlin, undeterred by the missiles from above. The V-weapons were a preview of the modern age of warfare. Terrifying, technologically advanced, and psychologically powerful. They demonstrated that science could amplify destruction, but they also revealed the limits of terror as a tool of strategy. A city may fear a missile, a nation may mourn its dead, but the machinery of war, once set in motion, cannot be derailed by fear alone. Thus, the real legacy of the V-1 and V-2 lies not in their battlefield effectiveness, but in their symbolic impact. They were instruments of vengeance, born of desperation, designed to frighten, to awe, and to punish. And while they inflicted enormous suffering, they ultimately failed to alter the outcome of the war. Hitler had gambled on fear as a weapon, and in that wager, the Allies won, demonstrating that courage, resilience, and organization could withstand even the deadliest innovation of human ingenuity. The price of fear was high. Thousands of lives lost, neighborhoods destroyed, and a continent terrorized. Yet the Allies endured. The V-weapons remind us that technology, no matter how advanced, is only as powerful as the strategy, purpose, and humanity that guides it. In the grand scope of the war, the V-1 and V-2 were a dark footnote, a chilling demonstration of what science could do under a tyrant, and a sobering lesson in the limits of terror. Beneath the mountains near Nordhausen, hidden from Allied reconnaissance and shielded from the world above, a labyrinth of tunnels stretched for miles. These were no ordinary mines or shelters. They were the site of Mittelbau-Dora, a secret underground complex where Hitler's most terrifying weapons of vengeance were born. Here, in the dark, cold, and oppressive depths, the V-2 rockets were assembled piece by piece, by hands that had no freedom, no hope, and no choice. The tunnels of Dora were engineering marvels in a technical sense. Conveyor systems carried the massive rocket engines from workshop to workshop. Cranes lifted fuselages of steel and aluminum. Werner von Braun and his team of engineers moved among this machinery like conductors of a symphony of destruction, refining guidance systems, calibrating gyroscopes, and perfecting the supersonic technology that had once seemed impossible. Each rocket represented the pinnacle of human ingenuity, the very edge of what science and engineering could achieve in the 1940s.
What is truly staggering about Mittelbau-Dora is the scale of its underground complex. This wasn't a single factory or a tunnel. It was effectively an entire subterranean city, stretching for miles beneath the Harz Mountains. Inside, prisoners lived and worked in appalling conditions, assembling V-2 rockets, while engineers and guards moved freely, overseeing the operations. There were workshops, storage areas, ventilation shafts, and even primitive living quarters, all designed to keep the weapons production running around the clock, hidden from Allied eyes. Today, much of the site has been transformed into a memorial and museum. Visitors walk through the same tunnels where thousands of prisoners suffered and died, seeing both the scale of the engineering feat and the horrific human cost. It's a place of reflection, a stark reminder that beneath the marvels of technology, there can be unimaginable suffering, and that human ingenuity, when divorced from morality, can produce both extraordinary achievement and profound tragedy.
And yet, for all its brilliance, Mittelbau Dora was a factory of death. The workforce consisted almost entirely of prisoners, political dissidents, Jews, Poles, Russians, and others deemed enemies of the Reich. They were brought from concentration camps, forced to live in squalid conditions, and made to work for 16, 18 hours a day in the choking dust of the tunnels. The conditions were horrific: cold, damp, and poorly ventilated. Accidents were common, and medical care was virtually non-existent. Those who faltered, fell ill, or resisted were executed on the spot or left to die in the dark corridors. Thousands perished during the construction of the tunnels and during the assembly of the rockets themselves. Despite this suffering, the technical output of Mittelbau Dora was extraordinary. The V-2 rockets that emerged from the tunnels were the first ballistic missiles in history, capable of supersonic speed and supremely difficult to intercept. It was a triumph of human ingenuity in the most brutal circumstances. But the cost was staggering. For every missile that flew into London or Antwerp, dozens of human lives had been destroyed in the production process. The genius of von Braun and his team was inseparable from the suffering of the enslaved laborers who made their work possible. The contrast was stark. Above ground, German propaganda celebrated technological miracles, presenting images of sleek rockets and laboratories. Below ground, in the tunnels of Dora, the reality was entirely different: a shadow world of hunger, fear, and death. Engineers calculated trajectories and refined propulsion systems while thousands of prisoners collapsed from exhaustion or disease. Each launchable V-2 was a testament to both brilliance and brutality, a reminder that innovation divorced from humanity can become a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. The layout of the tunnels themselves was extraordinary. Multi-level chambers connected by narrow passageways allowed assembly lines to operate simultaneously, with storage areas for engines, fuel tanks, and guidance equipment. Massive ventilation shafts attempted to clear the dust from the air, but often they failed, leaving workers to inhale clouds of metal shavings and soot. Guards patrolled constantly, ensuring no prisoner escaped, and the threat of violence was ever present. The combination of advanced engineering and totalitarian control made Mittelbau Dora unique, a place where human suffering and technical achievement existed side by side. Werner von Braun, the man often credited with bringing rocketry into the modern age, moved through these tunnels with a singular focus on his machines. To him, the work was pure science, pure engineering, abstract, mathematical, perfectible. Yet he was also part of a system that exploited human beings on an industrial scale. The ethical dimension of this achievement has haunted historians and engineers alike for decades. Could such technological brilliance ever be separated from the horror that created it? Mittelbau Dora forces that question upon anyone who studies it closely. Visualizing the tunnels today, one can imagine the scale of the operation. Dim lights lining vast corridors, cranes swinging massive rocket components, rows of tables where engines were painstakingly assembled. The clanging of tools, the hiss of welding torches, and the muffled cries of exhausted prisoners formed a grim symphony. Every inch of these tunnels was claimed for the war effort, every second of labor extracted at the expense of human life. The rockets, rising from this underworld, were symbols of both innovation and atrocity. Flying machines born from oppression. Yet even in this extreme environment, technical problems persisted. Rockets misfired, engines failed, guidance systems malfunctioned. Each failure risked not only the mission above ground, but also the lives of those forced to assemble the weapons. The engineer's brilliance could not erase the brutality of the conditions, and the human cost was constant and visible. Mittelbau-Dora became a place where precision engineering collided with unimaginable human suffering, producing machines that would terrify civilians far from the tunnels while leaving devastation behind in every corridor below. By the time Allied forces discovered and captured Mittelbau-Dora in April 1945, the tunnels had produced thousands of V-2 rockets, but at a staggering human toll. Estimates suggest that over 20,000 prisoners died during the construction and operation of the facility. The site stands as a stark reminder that technological achievement can be intertwined with cruelty, and that the history of science is not always separate from the history of human suffering. In the end, Mittelbau-Dora embodies the darkest contradictions of the V-weapons program. It was a place of unparalleled technical genius, the birthplace of rockets that would shape the modern era. But it was also a place of profound inhumanity, where enslaved laborers were worked to death in service of Hitler's vengeance. The V-2s that emerged from the tunnels carried with them not just explosives, but the weight of thousands of lives extinguished in their making. Mittelbau-Dora reminds us that history is rarely simple. It is a story of genius and horror intertwined, of innovation achieved at a devastating cost, and of human suffering rendered invisible in the pursuit of power. It stands as a warning. Technological advancement, divorced from ethics and compassion, can become the most efficient instrument of terror the world has ever known. As the tide of war turned inexorably against Germany, the Reich pinned its hopes on a series of technological marvels. Weapons so advanced that, in theory, they might have changed the course of the conflict. From the skies above Europe to the depths of the Atlantic, these machines promised a new kind of dominance. But in practice, ambition collided with reality, and the Wunderwaffe that was meant to secure victory instead arrived too late, in too few numbers, or under flawed strategy.
During the final years of the war, Nazi Germany was a hive of secret projects, dozens of experimental weapons, advanced aircraft, super-heavy tanks, and revolutionary submarines. The engineers were incredibly creative, often decades ahead of their time. But the problem wasn't innovation, it was timing. Many of these projects never left the drawing board or were produced in such small numbers that they could never influence the outcome. Germany simply ran out of time. It's chilling to imagine what might have happened if even a fraction of these Wunderwaffe had been deployed effectively. Hitler believed in the power of technological miracles, and in a regime willing to push innovation to the extreme, even these secret projects could have tipped the balance in his favor. The reality, though, is that while these weapons were awe-inspiring on paper, the combination of logistical failures, production delays, and Allied advances meant they never reached their full potential. History was decided not by fantasy weapons, but by the harsh arithmetic of war.
The jet nightmare. Messerschmitt. Me-262. Among the most famous of these was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Technically, it was a marvel, capable of speeds over 870 kilometers per hour, far faster than any Allied piston-engine aircraft, with powerful cannons capable of ripping bombers from the sky. It represented the culmination of German aeronautical engineering, a potential game-changer in the air war over Europe. Yet even this brilliant machine was ensnared by the dictates of Hitler's interference. Rather than deploying the Me-262 as a dedicated fighter, the Führer insisted it be used primarily as a fast bomber. Jets laden with bombs could never reach their potential. Pilots were forced to fly slow, dangerous bombing missions instead of exploiting the aircraft's speed and agility to dominate Allied formations. By the time Me-262 units were deployed in numbers, Allied air superiority was overwhelming. Fuel shortages, constant Allied attacks on airfields, and delayed production further eroded its effectiveness. Analysts argue that if the Me-262 had been deployed earlier, in greater numbers, and used properly as a fighter, it might have contested control of the skies over Germany, possibly slowing the Allied bombing campaign. Instead, it became a symbol of potential unfulfilled. Submarine giants, type V-1, U-boats. Beneath the waves, Germany sought a similar revolution in naval warfare. The type V-1 U-boat, or electro-boat, promised to transform the Battle of the Atlantic. Unlike earlier submarines, which could only remain submerged for a few hours, the type V-1 could operate underwater for days, recharging batteries much faster and traveling at higher submerged speeds. In theory, these boats could have evaded Allied convoys with impunity, striking with devastating effectiveness. But the promise of these submarines was never realized. Production delays, sabotage, and logistical failures meant that only a few entered service before the war ended. Crews often received minimal training, and the boats were delivered to a collapsing Reich, unable to coordinate their deployment. The Allies had already mastered convoy tactics, sonar detection, and air patrols. As a result, the revolutionary potential of the Type 21 was left on paper, its promise drowned before it could ever rise to dominate the seas. Tank monsters, Maus, and Ratte. On land, the Reich's ambitions were equally grandiose, if less practical. Germany's engineers conceived of super-heavy tanks, such as the Maus, and the even more fantastical Ratte, armored behemoths of absurd proportions. The Maus weighed nearly 200 tons, bristling with enormous cannons and thick steel plating, designed to be impervious to any Allied fire. The Ratte, never built, was intended to dwarf even the Maus, a mobile fortress weighing over 1,000 tons. These designs were emblematic of German perfectionism pushed to extremes, a fascination with technological supremacy divorced from battlefield reality. They were slow, fuel-hungry, and unable to traverse bridges or most roads. Deploying them in combat would have been a logistical nightmare, and they could never match the mobility and coordination of smaller, faster Allied tanks. In the end, they remained prototypes or blueprints, serving as symbols of a regime obsessed with awe-inspiring engineering rather than practical military strategy. The common thread: ambition over reality. Across air, sea, and land, these Wunderwaffe illustrate a common theme. Germany's pursuit of technical superiority outpaced its capacity to use that technology effectively. Revolutionary designs arrived too late, were too few in number, or were applied in ways that undermined their potential. The war had become a conflict of production and logistics, a battle of endurance and resources, industrial capacity, numbers, and coordination. Not the brilliance of individual machines determined the outcome. In each case, there was a haunting tension between ingenious engineering and strategic futility. The Me-262 could outfly any Allied fighter, yet was misused. The Type 21 could have dominated the Atlantic, yet never reached the numbers needed. The Maus and Ratte showcased technical ambition, but were impractical in every sense. These weapons, often referred to as miracle weapons, were miracles only in design, not in impact, legacy, and reflection. The story of these unrealized superweapons is not just a tale of missed opportunity. It is a lesson in the limits of technological obsession. They remind us that innovation alone cannot win a war. It must be paired with strategy, timing, and logistical support. Hitler sought awe-inspiring weapons to break the enemy's will, but he overlooked the fundamentals of warfare: production, coordination, and the relentless arithmetic of attrition. In the end, these machines remain a testament to human ingenuity and imagination, but also to the folly of overreach. they demonstrate that in a total war, numbers and logistics triumph over marvels, and that the pursuit of technological perfection cannot substitute for sound strategy. The superweapons that Germany placed its hopes upon were ultimately symbols of what might have been, rather than instruments that could have changed the course of history. By May 1945, the Third Reich lay in ruins. Cities were leveled, armies shattered, and Hitler's dreams of domination extinguished. Operation Paperclip had begun even before the guns fell silent, as Allied forces moved quickly to capture not only territory and documents, but the scientists and engineers behind Germany's most advanced weapons. The V-1s, the V-2s, the Messerschmitt jets, and the Type V-1 submarines were not enough to save the Reich. The Wunderwaffe, despite its promise and terror, had failed to alter the inevitable outcome of the war. Germany had been defeated, but its technology was only beginning its extraordinary journey. Operation Paperclip, led by the United States, relocated over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America, most prominently Wernher von Braun and his rocketry team. They carried with them the knowledge of supersonic flight, jet propulsion, and the secrets of ballistic missiles. These men, who had designed weapons intended to devastate European cities, now became architects of the American space program, responsible for the rockets that would carry satellites, astronauts, and eventually humans to the moon. In parallel, the Soviet Union captured its share of German technology and personnel, kickstarting its own space and missile programs. The Cold War was fueled in large part by the knowledge extracted from the laboratories, factories, and tunnels of Nazi Germany. The irony is stark. Weapons designed to terrify and destroy were repurposed into tools of exploration and scientific achievement. The V-2, which had rained death on London and Antwerp, became the direct ancestor of the Redstone, Atlas, and Saturn rockets. Jet technologies developed for the Me-262 informed the design of supersonic aircraft and advanced fighters. Even the Type V-1 U-boats influenced post-war submarine design, introducing new standards for endurance, speed, and underwater capabilities. The technology that should have cemented Hitler's victory instead propelled two global powers into the space age, reshaping geopolitics and human ambition alike. Yet this legacy is not without its shadows. The innovations that drove the Cold War forward were born in a climate of oppression, forced labor, and wartime desperation. Mittelbau Dora and similar facilities demanded enormous human sacrifice to produce the rockets and equipment that would later inspire awe rather than fear. The scientists and engineers, many of whom were complicit in or at least aware of these atrocities, carried both knowledge and ethical compromise into their post-war careers. Technology advanced, but humanity paid a staggering price. The failure of the Wunderwaffe underscores a critical lesson. Technological brilliance cannot replace strategy, logistics, or timing. The Me-262 could not stop Allied bombing raids. The V-2 could not halt the advance of the Red Army. The Type V-1 submarines were too few and too late to reverse the Battle of the Atlantic. In every theater of war, human ingenuity met the unforgiving arithmetic of mass production, coordination, and attrition. Despite its sophistication, Germany's advanced technology arrived too late, was applied too sparingly, and could not overcome the momentum of the Allied war machine. And yet, in the post-war world, that same technology became a foundation for global competition, a new kind of arms race, and a new frontier for humanity. Rockets that once fell upon cities now soared into orbit. Jet engines that had harried Allied bombers powered the fastest aircraft in the skies. Submarine innovations reshaped naval strategy. The tools of vengeance were transformed into tools of exploration and power projection. The Cold War, the space race, and even modern missile defense owe their origins, in part, to the final years of Nazi experimentation. In retrospect, the story of Germany's Wunderwaffe is a study in contrasts. They were terrifying, awe-inspiring, and devastating in a localized sense. But their strategic value was minimal. They could not save the Reich. Yet they were far from meaningless. The knowledge embedded in these weapons, the lessons learned in production, aerodynamics, propulsion, and guidance, formed a bridge from the horrors of World War II to the frontiers of the space age. Humanity would pay the same price in effort and imagination, but now for progress rather than destruction. The ultimate paradox of the Wunderwaffe is this: they failed to prevent defeat, yet they succeeded in changing the world forever. Germany's rockets, jets, and submarines, intended to destroy, instead became stepping stones to the moon, to orbit, and to the modern age of aerospace and missile technology. In this way, the Third Reich lost the war, but science and technology triumphed, ensuring that the legacy of those secret projects endured far beyond the collapse of the Reich. History, then, preserves a dual narrative: the destruction wrought by human ambition, and the creativity that survived to inspire and advance humanity. The weapons designed to break nations ultimately propelled humanity beyond Earth itself. In defeating Germany, the Allies won the war. In capturing its technology, they inherited the future. Victory over the Reich was absolute. But victory over technology, as history would soon reveal, was a different story entirely.